Good morning, everyone. For today's distinguished webinar series in Artificial Intelligence Cybersecurity, today's speaker is Jay Johnson, Chief Technology Officer at DER Security Corporation. The title for the talk today is Application of AI to Secure Distributed Energy Systems. Jay is a Chief Technology Officer at DER Security Corp, a startup company focused on DER communications, power operations, and security. Jay's team is building cybersecurity protection, detection, and response technologies for EV chargers, renewable energy installations, and energy storage systems. Previously, Jay was a distinguished member of technical staff at Sandia National Laboratories, where he led research projects totaling $25 million in areas of power system control, optimization, and security. Jay has authored more than 150 academic papers, had 8 issued patents, and was interviewed for Wired, Forbes, NPR, and several other media outlets on his EV charger cybersecurity research. Jay received a BS in Mechanical Engineering from University of Missouri-Rolla in 2006 and Master's in Mechanical Engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology in 2009. Jay, it is a distinct honor for us to host you as part of the webinar series here at the University of North Dakota as part of Center for Cybersecurity Research. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk. And the floor is yours now to share your screen.
Thank you so much, Jameson. That's wonderful. Okay, let me click the right buttons and try to get this up. Can you see my slides?
Yes, good. You can go ahead.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, yeah, so let's get started. This is a talk about the application of artificial intelligence to secure distributed energy systems. Those systems that we're talking about are displayed here. So it could be large or even residential scale solar installations, EV charger installations, wind systems, etc. So think about power systems connected at the grid edge at the lower voltage levels. And so this, to kick things off, I thought it would be nice to provide a little background in addition to my bio. So relatively new start here as the CTO at DER Security Corp. This is a startup spun out of the SunSpec Alliance, which is a trade alliance of about 180 companies that are related to the solar industry. And there's quite a bit of IP related to communications protocols and capabilities for kind of software stacks for interacting with these DER devices that came from the SunSpec Alliance over to DERSec. Previously, I spent 13 years at Sandia National Laboratories. I led about somewhere on the order of $25 million in research for DOE CSER, which is the cybersecurity office, renewable energy office, and Office of Electricity and Power System Control Optimization and Cybersecurity Research. I was the co-convener along with Tom Tansey, who's now my CEO of DERSec. We started up the Sandia SunSpec DER Cybersecurity Work Group 6 years ago, and we had a webinar series as well. And there's those webinars online. If you're curious to get more of this content, you can go online and see those. Also, probably germane to this conversation, I led a bunch of penetration testing for microgrids, EV chargers, and DER devices that gave me an understanding of the types of attacks that could exist on these devices. Prior to working at Sandia, I was a sustainability fellow at Park, where I was studying demand response, and I was a 3-time intern at NREL, working with the wind group there and solar thermal group. As stated before, have mechanical engineering degrees, wrote a bunch of papers, happy to talk about those at some point. And in the last couple of years, I got a lot of publicity, which was nice, but also a little intimidating, to talk about some of our work with Wired and Forbes on the cybersecurity risks to EV chargers. And Dale Peterson picked up some wind work that we were doing and talking about metrics for wind systems and the risk to cyber attacks on those systems with different layers of security controls there. So if you want, you can hear more about that on the Unsolicited Response podcast. And for fun, I'm a mountain rescue volunteer. I love skiing, and I'm a father to a 2-year-old that's an awesome Strider bike rider. So let's move on. The agenda here is let's talk about our changing power system and where we're headed in 2050. Attacks on DER systems. You can see some of those DER devices on the right there, and our DERSec intrusion detection and mitigation systems that we're working on. And then honestly, I haven't been hands-on keyboard doing a lot of AI work personally, but I have been engaged in several of these activities and would like to talk about some of the challenges there and how we can use AI to better detect adversarial operations in DER systems. So the new energy market, I guess there's several ways to measure this, but if you look at dollars, it's almost a $200 trillion investment by 2050 in all of these energy storage, wind systems, solar, et cetera, from Bloomberg. We're expecting about 20% growth in EV installations in DER for the next few years. And right now, there's somewhere on the order of about 4 million PV installations in the US with 55,000 public EV chargers. Although I believe that number is a little outdated now. I suspect it's much larger, probably about 10% larger. So what's interesting about these devices? What's different from the traditional power systems that have operated for 100 years? Well, as opposed to having large thermal generation, we now have these small generators spread out across the grid. Oftentimes, they're easy to access physically, and they're all network connected through the internet, or at least the vast majority are. So we have new cybersecurity requirements. In terms of solar in particular, we've seen a lot of growth. And this chart was released by SEIA a few weeks ago, which shows some numbers that are really staggering. So we're expecting from today, which we have about 5% of our electricity coming from solar and 11% from wind, that we're going to be going about 4 times larger than that over the next decade, to 500 gigawatts, which, I remember attending a conference out in, I think it was the Netherlands about a decade ago, talking about solar installations, and everybody was so excited that we had crossed like the 50 gigawatt mark globally. And now we're talking about 10 times that just in the United States. So the numbers are really staggering. Our total installation in this year alone for total new capacity, 45% of that is coming from solar. And you can see some of the statistics here showing just the magnitude of the change from those larger coal plants, natural gas plants, to solar and other renewables. So it's happening, and we need to definitely secure these things in the appropriate way. And why do I say that? Well, the threat is real, and the need to secure them is real. And here are some headlines from the last 5 or so years talking about some of the risks that are represented. So I won't talk about all these, but maybe just highlight a few. So in the upper right is the Fred Monet article from DEF CON 24, where he was able to use some local pen testing techniques to gain access to his residential solar installation and then pivot upstream into the cloud. And he was able to access over 1,000 different devices on the network there. There was a famous case here where during the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there were some components in EV chargers in Russia that had been manufactured in Ukraine, and the company that manufactured them had a way to update the firmware, kind of a backdoor or perhaps an intentional way to update vulnerabilities in that, but they used that to essentially brick the devices, making them unable to charge, and they displayed pro-Ukraine, anti-Putin messages. Similarly, in the UK, EV chargers were hacked to display some pornographic content. And then there's been several wind sites that have been found vulnerable over the years as well as like the S Power you see here, the S Power attack on the renewables company in Utah, where they were unable to see, I think it was 500 megawatts of PV and wind systems at that time. Actually, the first disruption of the U.S. power grid was recorded at that time. If you want to know more of the technical details, I would recommend this Energies paper that was put together, I don't know, about a year ago now. It goes through a lot of the vulnerabilities that have been publicly disclosed, as well as the potential impact of the power grid, users, etc., and then discussing defenses that may be deployed to prevent these types of things. And so we wrote this paper, Sandia published something on it, and then Wired picked that up, which was pretty cool. So they interviewed me, and I got a chance to talk to them about some of the vulnerabilities that exist in these internet-connected devices, as well as the public charging hardware. So please take a look at that Wired article if you'd like. So I'm going to primarily be talking about solar today, but I think this could be applied to EV chargers, wind systems, and other devices as well. Here is a representation of a communication network for a PV installation or a PV network. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'll wiggle it around. So area EPS operator, that is your utility. This is IEEE 1547 parlance for the utility. And so essentially over here, you've got a distributed energy resource management system that's connected to their OT network. You've got potentially some utility-owned sites down here at the bottom. But the interesting thing is you're running communications across the public internet. That's this middle line here. And so you could have the virtual power plants or third-party aggregators up here. You also have the DER vendor themselves up in this upper right bubble. And then the DER equipment is in the lower right, where you've got a DER client, perhaps like a bump in the wire translator that would go from IEEE 2030.5 to Sunspec Modbus or something similar to that on your site. These could be large commercial installations. They could be potentially even larger utility-owned assets that just aren't connected through fiber connections or other dedicated utility copper. And then you've got, for the larger installations or facilities, maybe a microgrid controller or some other facilities DERMS on site. And so I put this up here to give you a sense of just the connectivity between all these different entities, but also that we can overlay on top of this some of the potential threats that exist. And so let's walk through a few of these things. So you've got your what I would call very traditional cyber attacks on like utilities on the left, where you've got maybe a spear phishing campaign or something like that, where you gain access to the IT network. And then from that, you are able to pivot to the OT network, where you could maybe interact with the DERM systems and issue malicious commands to that environment. In the upper left, you've got a denial of service campaign similar to the S-Power attack that I was just talking about, where you lose visibility into your operations, into your site. Actually, there's a great Wired article that just came out on the Mirai botnet. I don't know if anybody's picked that up, but take a look at it. I'm about halfway through that article. It's fantastic. Andy Greenberg, once again, did a great job reporting it. Turns out Mirai, for years, it was suspected it was a Russian campaign or Chinese campaign, is actually orchestrated by 3 teenagers. So interesting in terms of the powers of these botnets that have come out, and denial of service using internet connected routers and other small IoT devices. So you've also got sorry for the divergence there, but you've also got machine in the middle or replay attacks, similar things to what you would see on OT networks. Misconfigured firewalls could allow access. Side channel attacks, we've seen a lot of this recently for EV chargers, where you can do something where you actually communicate RF signals to block the charging session. It's called broken wire. Some great research out of the University of Oxford, if you're curious about that. Cloud service vulnerabilities, we've heard all of these horror stories for years about directory traversal, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, etc. Or the big thing with vehicle APIs these days is that they don't have the proper authentication and authorization requirements. And so adversaries are able to interact with these vehicles. A big report out on that recently, where I think it was 16 different manufacturers or vehicles were found vulnerable. Malicious code that's been signed, like Sunburst, that's the SolarWinds one, or downgrade attacks where you actually update, quote unquote, update the firmware to a lower version that had a vulnerability and then exploit that. And then your on-site stuff. So poorly secured interfaces, this is a big deal for PV systems and EV chargers. Media that could be extracted, for instance, if you're storing your operating system on removable media, it's very easy to take that out. And if it's not encrypted, modify it, maybe add a couple of users to the Etsy user account, and then away you go. And so all of these things exist. These are the potential threats. We need to protect against this. How are we going to do that? Well, after coming up with a lot of really cool ideas at Sandia National Labs, I decided that it was time to make the leap into the private sector. And so I've joined DERSec to do just that and commercialize some solutions. So two of the solutions you see here. The first one is on the left, the DERSec Shield. This is designed to protect cloud assets or potentially on-prem utility systems. And it will run most likely as a rack mount server or as a cloud application. And that protects like the head end system from the adversaries connected to the internet. On the other side of the connection, you've got your field assets. So we have the DERSec client, which is connected potentially as a bump in the wire deployment or software either running on a protocol translator or the inverter itself. And this is doing deep packet inspection on DER communications like Sunspec Modbus, IEEE 2030.5, or DMP3. And then you've got your commercial installations or utility scale installations where we would prefer not to be critical in the path because these are certainly critical assets. And so we would see ourselves more likely being connected to a span port in those situations where we would be monitoring that deployment through that span port or mirror port on a local switch, and then alerting the asset owner to vulnerabilities as those come across. We also have the ability to virtualize these devices. We can clone devices. And so you can put canaries or decoys out there in the field, especially in these larger solar installations where you have, say, somewhere on the order of 20 to 100 inverters out on the site. We can add additional simulated devices that if any communications goes to those devices, we would know that that is likely a reconnaissance campaign or some other malicious action to interact with that equipment. So under the hood, here's what we're going to be doing. We've got our network data analysis, very similar to any sort of firewall or any host-based intrusion detection system that uses that. Got your Zeek or Bro logs, snort rules, ARP watch, these types of things to detect anomalies. A lot of heuristic rules that, say certain IPs are on an allow or a block list. You can also apply AI and ML at that level. But the proprietary thing and what we've been doing that's different from business as usual in terms of cybersecurity is we also extract from the communications traffic the physical power information. And that means voltage, frequency, power, reactive power, curves, control curves like volt var, frequency, droop, etc. And we can apply our rules to that. And these rules I'll go into in a little more detail here shortly. But they represent heuristic rules, stateful analysis. We can, as I said before, virtualize these devices, and so creating digital twins. And then we've got our AI pipeline as well acting on this. And then the magic, I think, is the combination of these two things. So if we can correlate using timestamps and other things that, hey, this interaction at this particular time all of a sudden triggered some sort of physical change in the system, and link those two things together in a way that we can do very quick and very accurate incident response and mitigation. That's really the objective here, is to be able to take human operators out of the loop ultimately and let the system protect itself, at least put it into a safe operating mode long enough that somebody can figure it out. And so we can certainly alarm, we can give human operators a list of options on what they could do, but we could also automate this. And so here's our anomaly detection techniques that we're developing now. So kind of on the left side, you'll see greater speed, meaning very quick, you can block the packets in real time. And then on the right, probably higher fidelity, more detailed, but possibly running a little bit more slowly. And so response times may be delayed. And so let's walk through a few different scenarios here. So packet level analysis, pretty straightforward, right? You've got your network traffic running by. We know how to convert the deep packet data, the application layer data, from those bits and bytes into physical meaning. And so as an example, say you've got a frequency droop curve, you see the points come across the wire, you say, hey, wait a second, they've, for whatever reason, whoever sent this command picked an extremely steep and aggressive droop curve. That would mean if there's any small deviation in grid frequency, which happens all the time, this device, say a battery system, is going to be oscillating like crazy, from injecting tremendous amounts of active power to absorbing tremendous amounts of active power very rapidly. And so you get these tiny, deviations in 60 hertz frequency all the time. It's bouncing around like this. But if those tiny changes, which normally would exist in a deadband for a frequency droop curve, if those actually are producing this, that would be very, very bad. And we know that. Everybody knows that. And so can we say, if something comes with a slope more aggressive than, whatever, 0.1 hertz per nameplate capacity, 100% nameplate capacity, something like that, we're gonna block it. We don't need to have that reaching our device. That is going to put the device and the power system in an unstable and unsafe operating mode. So we can block it there. Okay, let's take a step to the right. Stateful detection. So if, for instance, those commands or set points are issued over a period of time, or we're measuring the response of the device, it's going to take much longer to figure out what's going on. And so you need to save or record what's going on over a longer period of time. Say, for instance, a firmware update goes to the DER device at midnight or sometime at night. And then the following day, you see the inverter is operating with an inverted volt var curve. So volt var is autonomous functionality, whereas the grid voltage swinging back and forth over the course of the day or course of even months. When it's high voltage, you are normally absorbing reactive power from the grid so that you can bring down the voltage. And when the grid voltage is low, you inject reactive power so you can bring up the voltage. If you flip that, you're actually destabilizing the power system. You're injecting reactive power, which is increasing the voltage at a high voltage state. And so you're making things much worse. And so anytime you see behavior like that, where you are measuring grid voltage and you're measuring the output of reactive power, and you see that behavior, you know something's wrong, and you can alert people to that problem. And so by having the stateful detection, we can see when the volt-var curve command was issued, or a firmware update, or some other command, and then we can see the change in behavior of that. And we can correlate that change is likely from this location or this update or something like this, take the appropriate response and mitigation. And you can do the same similar types of things for all these other grid support functions as well. Okay, digital twins takes it up a notch yet again. And so as opposed to just doing these kind of simple rules or boundaries, we can run a simulated DER device over a long period of time, side by side with the physical one. And this is helpful for larger sites, for instance, that would have irradiance sensors or power meters or other things, and you can feed the digital twin with out-of-band traffic, so that if you compromise the physical device, you still have a baseline truth that's out of band of that physical data that's coming from the inverter itself, which could be lying to you if there's a man-in-the-middle attack or something similar. So we can replicate what we anticipate the device doing. For instance, if we have an irradiance feed, we can say, okay, our irradiance is 800 watts per meter squared now. We anticipate that's roughly equivalent to 80% of nameplate capacity based on the history of this device. Okay, for whatever reason, there's no curtailment functions enabled, but we're operating much lower than that. We're operating at 20%. And oh, look, it hasn't changed in some period of time. Clear flag there. Something is going wrong. Probably there's a physical fault or some other issue with the PV system, or potentially there's been a cyber attack. Either way, we want to alert people that there's some problem with the operations of the system. And when we're talking about large 10, 100 megawatt sites, this is very critical. I mean, that's a ton of money that you're losing if you're curtailed for that long period of time. Okay, and then lastly, the machine learning classification is shown here on the right. And so back when I was at Sandia National Labs, Shamina Hoyson-McKenzie, Burke Jones, and others worked with myself and several others to do work for detection using different techniques, using a bump in the wire device for PV systems. And this actually won an R&D 100 award back in 2022, which is a big feather in the cap for the team and nice. And so here you can see a volt-var curve versus active power and some points there. And so we were trying to bound what we considered good behavior using different techniques. So we've recently, working with George Fragos and others at Sandia, have been looking at autoencoders potentially as another method to flag these things. And so this is capturing more complex behavior that the simple rule sets that we've generated wouldn't capture. And so there are quite, there's hundreds of these set points and control modes in these modern DER devices. And so the complex behavior of enabling multiple reactive power modes and active power modes at the same time may be difficult to write every single possible rule for. But if we have some AI technology in place to capture that gives us the power. So what makes this difficult? Well, we need representative data sets, and to generate those large data sets, it takes quite a bit of work. And there's diversity in both the physical devices that we're working with, but also the locations they're operating. So if you look at irradiance profiles in, say, Hawaii, it's very partially cloudy. You get days where it's like jiggy, 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 jiggy like this. Out here, I live in New Mexico in Albuquerque, and so we get basically very nice sunny days and then cloud banks that roll in. So you kind of get these step changes. None of this partially cloudy stuff. And so all of that physically, plus let's say you've got battery systems, different PV technologies, different topologies, et cetera, make classifying these things not a one-off solution, right? You need to have kind of a generic or global solution for this. And so we need to construct a balanced and representative data set. And it needs to include both normal operations, which is relatively easy to gather all that data because we've got gigs and gigs of it from all the vendors and manufacturers that are collecting it, and site owners and asset owners, but also abnormal data sets, right? So placing the systems in bad states, running the PV systems in what we would classify as an attacked scenario. That's much more difficult to do. And that's where some of our virtualization technology comes in, where we can simulate the behavior of the DER devices, and we can capture over a long period of time what it looks like when they're placed in these inverted volt-var states or aggressive frequency droop curves, or you name it, different operating states that normally the devices would not be working in. And then we want to not just capture the physical data, which is great, voltages, currents, frequencies, etc. But we want to see what that traffic looks like in terms of round trip times, IP and MAC addresses, packet lengths. Maybe normal traffic, you only get packet lengths of a few bytes, but then if you have these large chunks with scan attacks or something, adversaries doing massive scans of your device, that could indicate an issue of some kind. And then on the right, you see the ML pipeline, which I'll walk through here a little bit. So this is work that George Fragos was putting together for actually wind systems, but it's very similar concept for any power time history and doing the analysis here. So we've got a data pre-processing step where you might have missing data or some other issues where you need to rebalance things, clean it up, scale it, etc. Then we want to fuse all the cyber and physical data into a data lake, and then apply a feature extraction methodology to do that. A lot of, I'll go into this here in a minute, but a lot of different ways of reducing the parameter set. As I said, there are hundreds of DER set points and control points that exist there. So we don't really want to work with that many. If we can decrease using an autoencoder or a principal component analysis, the number of parameters that we're interacting with, it makes our life so much better. And then you can apply your classifier. In this particular case, well, I'll talk about this in a moment, but offline tends to be the preferred method. We don't want to do a lot of training while we're on site for the system, although recurrent training is most likely going to be necessary because, as I was saying, different sites have different behaviors, and we want to learn those things. So that's the idea. So let's talk about some of the steps here. So if we want to take, let's say, those 100 some odd set points in the device, plus who knows how many higher level network parameters of round trip times and IP addresses, MAC addresses, etc., and compress that down into a nice, healthy subset of features of, like, I don't know, 5 or 10 maybe would be nice. It's a challenge, right? And so figuring out how to do that is tricky. And so that's where the principal component analysis, and autoencoders is really nice, is to identify which features are the ones that are most critical for differentiating these abnormal behaviors from the physical or normal, good operations. And so with all this complexity, there are some risks of overfitting your data and not generalizing it for unseen data, which is common with these types of things. And so once you have identified maybe an autoencoder to take all those parameters and compress them down to a few that are meaningful for you, then you want to actually run your training. And so there's a few different options here. SVMs are one where you have a hyperplane of these different parameters, and you hopefully in that plane you've got your red bad things and your blue or green good things, and you can cleanly slice, hey, if the operations are here on this side of the hyperplane, flag it, that's clearly bad. Or if it's on this side, it's good. So as soon as you cross that boundary, we're gonna flag it. And you could probably move that hyperplane a little up or a little down, depending on how aggressive you want to flag it. There's been a lot of concerns within the industry of false positives, which is very understandable. So maybe you want to set your threshold pretty high. It actually has to be significantly on the far side of that plane to trigger an alert. And so that would be a nice way to mitigate the risk of those false positives. Random forests, this is a set of decision trees to perform the classification. Gradient boosting is kind of a gradient-based approach that can also be used. Offline DRL is another one where you kind of see it in the pictures down here. We've got reinforcement learning, where you're interacting with an environment to train a policy that is the optimal policy for achieving some goal. DRLs or reinforcement learning is really big because it plays video games well, and it can do all these things that are pretty sophisticated because it learns the environment and what is needed to optimize its reward, its feedback from that environment. But offline reinforcement learning is better in this particular case because we can run the learning on a set of data that is pre-recorded. And then as opposed to interacting with the system live, especially in a cyber environment, we don't want to learn if the system is being like slowly manipulated over a long period of time. We don't want to learn that that's normal behavior. So we can train it offline and then deploy those agents in the field once it's been trained, and then maybe tweak a few things with this recurrent training methodology, which would capture things like seasonal changes or diurnal shifts or other things, or maybe your PV site gets shade because of a tree at a certain time of day. It could pick up on those types of things with the training for that particular location or that deployment. All right, and I am checking the watch here, so I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on the last few slides here talking about response, and then we'll go to Q&A, and look forward to that. So in terms of response, this is where it gets interesting. So we've talked a lot about the detection capabilities, but okay, you found something, and what do we do about that, right? So there's been a lot of work using security orchestration, automation, and response, or SOAR technologies. Here is a SOC, or a security operations center maturity model that kind of walks from the very manual, hey, we're getting alerts, we're getting alarms, let's go out to the computer, see what's going on, figure it out, all the way to more advanced data-focused approaches where you have a single pane of glass, a SIEM that tells you, hey, we're getting data in from all these IDSs. We can see that in a visual environment. We got these things flagging. I'd say that's probably pretty close to where we are now. Next step up is in the automation phase, where we're like building playbooks that autonomously respond to particular settings and issue commands to firewalls and things like that to block the adversary. And then this resilience focus endpoint here, which is prediction, where it says, hey, we're getting threat intelligence that tells us that something is going on. We've seen a lot of additional traffic in this particular area. We think something's going to happen here. Can we harden in a way that makes sense prior to something bad going on to prevent us, even if that means we're losing some of our capabilities temporarily? So dynamic defenses and moving target defense, that type of thing. Okay, so in the last year, we wrote a nice book chapter. You can see in the lower left here on this idea. We deployed a bump in the wire device in front of and I'll use my mouse. We put a bump in the wire IDS, intrusion detection system, right here in front of a solar inverter. And then we had a security operations center that had a SIEM plus a SOAR system. So this is the autonomous response. And then we had our adversary over here in the right side that was launching these coordinated attacks that do I have a list of them? Yeah, denial of service, man in the middle, ARP, spoofing types of things, and malicious Modbus commands. Those were the things that we issued here. And then the system responded very quickly, less than 30 seconds to anything here, captured the traffic in the bump in the wire device, pushed that data up to the SIEM, the visualization platform. In our case, we were using an Elasticsearch Grafana stack. We pulled that by our SOAR system to look for particular anomalies, which you can see in the playbook on the right here, which I'm not going to walk through. And then respond by issuing a block command to in our case, we were communicating here to the bump in the wire device to block particular IPs that we saw this malicious behaviors from. And so that was a proof of concept for what we'd like to do. And we're actually going to expand this approach in an upcoming project, which I'll talk about here in a second. And that is the Goaltender project. So this was recently awarded. It was a $5 million project funded by the cybersecurity office at DOE. And it is designed to secure the DERMS perimeter for several different entities. In particular, we're going to be working with Southern California Edison and ChargePoint to protect their cloud infrastructure. And this project's led by Sandia National Laboratories. I have the honor of putting together the proposal before I left. And we've got a really outstanding team that you can see on the right here. And the purpose of this is to build this cloud-based solution where we incorporate next generation firewalls to do the deep packet inspection, extract that data out, and then pass that along to our SOAR platform for our response, where we can apply our physical analysis that I talked extensively about here, but also applying more traditional antivirus rules to that. We can detonate some of these payloads in a sandbox, and we can apply our AI classifiers as well. And then if we do see something, we're going to have a cyber analyst review that. We can pass that along to external threat sharing organizations, log it, of course, and then have our playbooks trigger some sort of response, which is likely to update firewall rules, maybe push known good firmware or known good DER control states back to the devices, etc. So that is it for me. I think I'm pretty close to on time, and I will turn it over to any questions. And I think
Hey, thank you, Jay, for an insightful presentation, and appreciate. I think we have a lot of questions coming in, so let me start. The first question is from Dr. Craig Rieger from INL. I think from. Do you have any industry demonstration sites for technology and specific attributes to discuss?
We are working with several utilities and several vendors right now to identify those sites. But as of right now, we haven't deployed anything in the field yet, but we've been running it in simulation. So that's going to be coming up pretty shortly here. So And hi, Craig. I haven't seen you in a while. I hope retirement's treating you well.
Great. And the next question is, cyber attacks evolve rapidly as the AI and technology landscape evolves. How DERSec or in general, cybersecurity teams can make sure that we're ready to defend new generation attacks like AI-assisted malware and phishing emails that escape all filters?
Yeah, great question. It's interesting. I was listening to Dale Peterson's podcast just the other day, and he was talking about his S4 agenda on this. And he said that he didn't include a lot of offensive talks this year at S4, primarily because most of the technologies or most of the techniques that are deployed on OT systems haven't changed a whole lot. And so there's perhaps a misnomer or a misunderstanding about how sophisticated a lot of these OT attacks are. I think they're in general pretty standardized. I mean, there's new malware that comes up all the time, right? There's big talk about Pipe Dream not that long ago and the approach that it took there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not that sophisticated or not that different, right, from what you've seen before. Reversing binaries, finding issues, maybe using Telnet or something to dump payloads onto OT devices or IoT devices. So yes, let's just say, I think you're right. There's going to be new risks out there, new threats. There's going to be things that we can't predict, and that's where the AI hopefully can pick up on anomalous behavior physically as opposed to in the network traffic, and alert on that. So I think this is actually one of the big selling points of this whole idea, is that as opposed to purely looking at signatures or even behavior-based indications of anomalies, we're looking at the physical data. Physical data can't lie, right? You got your radiances, you've got your voltages, you've got your frequency. All of that, we know how it's supposed to behave. We've got 100+ years of experience on how power systems operate. If something is going on there that isn't right, we know that 100% guaranteed. How did the malware or something get into that state? We may not know that 100%, but we can certainly flag on the physical problems. And so I think that's what we offer that perhaps other people haven't considered before.
The next question we have is, thank you very much for your presentation. How about if there may be AI systems that are capable, I think somebody is, what is it? Okay.
That's still free rounds.
No, I think this is here.
They're in order that they were posted.
Okay. How do you address the challenge of balancing the need for real-time threat response with the potential risk of false positive, given the critical nature of DER system and the potential impact on grid stability and reliability?
Yeah, as I was talking about earlier, the false positive situation is something that is top of mind for everyone involved in this, right? So there are thresholds that we can place on, well, let's give an example so we can talk about that. Let's say, as I was describing before, we've got these volt bar curves. And we know if we're measuring voltage and reactive power, those points should fall along that curve, at least pretty close. If we see something off of that curve by 10%, we could flag that as potentially some sort of maloperation. Maybe we don't do that. Maybe we work with the asset owner to say, at what level do we really want to start alerting? And it could be at the 20% mark, could be at the 25% mark. That would cut out a huge percentage of potential false positives. And so it is my intent to work with the asset owners directly to set their thresholds to where it is most applicable for that installation. And that may be a difficult conversation, because of course you want to alert as quickly as possible. Of course you want to say, hey, something bad's going on here. But if that means that you're getting so many alerts that you get operator fatigue and they just hit the mute button over and over and say, whatever alarm, go away, that doesn't help anybody. So let's set the thresholds appropriately that we're triggering when it's time.
Speaking of the threshold, how do you ensure, what are the time scales? And do we have, here's a question that says, what are the time scales involved in the detection of malicious packets and requirement for taking actions on them? And how can we prove that this timing constraints will be satisfied?
Yeah, this will be a big topic that we discuss in the Goaltender project. We were able to block packets in real time with the simple rules. So these like packet level rules that say, if you're within a certain region or something, just don't pass that along to your end device. What gets really tough, and I think probably impossible, is to capture that packet or that payload, if it's like an XML payload or something like that, strip it out and then like push that to a sandbox environment where you have a simulated DERMS and see if it spins up new processes, see if there's a new user added, see if something like that happens. This is going to be really difficult because that whole like virtual machine spinning it up, running it, doing the analysis, that cannot happen in packet speed, right? Where you're probably gonna, you got certainly sub-second that you want to move that packet along to the end DERMS system, or vice versa. So what do? Well, you probably are just going to let it go through, and if it doesn't catch the first filter, at least you can alarm after the fact and say, hey, there's something bad that happened here. We caught it. Yeah, it happened a whole 1 or 2 minutes ago, but at least we caught it. So now what do? You respond, you take the appropriate mitigation. And hopefully that prevents, if you've got some sort of like code injection or other attack or user interface, you can lock it down at that point. And so it's not blocking it, but it is responding appropriately. So this is going to be a huge topic for the Goaltender project, and we should have a lot more answers to that shortly.
Here's a question that I have, and in your communication with vendors, DERMS, I think, when I talk to a lot of ADMS vendors or AMI, there are a lot of disagreements in terms of, do DERMS resides on ADMS or AMI? Now you're talking about cloud platforms. How do you see the IDS, play? Where would that fit in? How does security features? Does it going to have good interoperability? Does it matter where DERMS reside, or are there any unified agreement? What is your perspective? Do you see more integration with ADMS or AMI? What is your context on that?
My viewpoint on this is that you want to protect the two ends of that internet segment, right? So you want to have some protections in the field. So you want to have detection there, so that if somebody's issuing a command from the public internet, you can filter it and find it there. And you also want to protect your cloud or head-end systems. And so you have a separate IDS or whatever, in our case, we call it the shield solution that exists there that filters things on that side. And so these tools will protect the whole OT environment. If your commands are going to an ADMS, if your commands are going to a DERMS, if your commands are going to an outage management system, if whatever exists on that side, and they all have different names and mean different things, doesn't matter to me, right? It's a standardized communication protocol. It's a standard API call. It's whatever. We're looking at the data that's passing through that. We're seeing that this payload, which normally would never be decrypted and analyzed, we can decrypt and analyze. And if it includes something malicious, we're going to flag it. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, I think, here's another question. In slide 10, there are multiple DARSec clients in a shield to monitor and establish end-to-end security. But what if the adversary plugged into one of the DER clients via devices like Raspberry Pi and send requests like a legitimate client that's not classified as an anomaly? How would you address this?
So this is like right physically at the device. You have physical access to the equipment and you're issuing a valid Modbus command. In that particular case, we would not detect it until any sort of measurement data came from the device and we could say, okay, something has happened here. It's very similar to the firmware, malicious firmware update that I talked about, or for whatever reason the firmware was corrupted. You don't pick it up immediately, but over time you see that things are drifting away from the normal operating mode, and you can flag that then. This particular situation where you're modifying Modbus per a single device in the field, I mean, at that point you could physically throw a disconnect switch. You could physically take bolt cutters and chop through wires. You could do a lot of things at that point as well. In all of these situations, we can't protect against that immediately, but we can respond once we collect enough data to see that the anomalous behavior has occurred. And so I think it's an interesting question. It's a hard one, right? In my dream world, we're actually deploying this technology inside the inverters themselves, and it's running as like a Dockerized sub-process within that Linux environment, and we can detect it there. That's the dream situation, because you place it as close to the power electronics controls as possible. And so if somebody taps into that inverter, you catch it there. That's not going to be the first generation, though. The first generation is likely to be these bump in the wire solutions.
I think we'll end the webinar. One last question. Speaking of deploying all these, machine learning in your either the DOC's project or your communication with people or in your own work, have you talked about or discussed about scenarios where containers being compromised, and how do you ensure the integrity of machine learning against model poisoning or training data being attacked? And how would scenarios such like could be handled?
Yeah, that's always the fear, right? Is you have a poisoned data supply and you train on a system that has been compromised or otherwise manipulated. And so you've learned normal behavior is actually an attacked behavior, and you'll never flag on that. This is a good question. I think that we can minimize the risk and not set it to zero, but we can minimize the risk by collecting data from several different organizations, several different types of devices, and several different scales, like sizes of things. You could have a 3 kilowatt residential one, as well as larger multi-megawatt commercial or small utility scale installations. And by doing that, by having that diversity, you've generalized enough that hopefully, if there is truly a compromised device or something behaving inappropriately, that hasn't poisoned the global training data in a way that would compromise your device. But a sensitivity analysis there would be very important to do. It would be interesting to perform that study.
Oh, I know I said last question, but I think I have one more. Communication protocols. What is your take on, which of those, there are so many communication protocols out there, what is your take on, the vulnerabilities perspective or, against adversaries, which one of these protocols, are more susceptible to different types of attacks? Are there any, I know it's kind of it's going to be, it's a very open-ended question. It's actually a loaded question as well. It all depends, but I'm just asking, do you see any, what is your perspective of likelihood of attacks happening on certain communication protocol over the other?
Sure. Yeah, what a loaded question. So in general, right, most of the most of the solar inverters are still communicating Modbus, which is not encrypted in general, although you can encrypt it. So that is a ripe target for these attacks. For the EV charging environment, OCPP 1.6 is also unencrypted, so that's a vulnerable protocol, and we actually have some forthcoming work in that area. The OCPP 2.0.1 is encrypted, so for EV chargers, that's going to be a major improvement in terms of security for that. At the, what I would say at the like gateway and up level for most of these installations, you're communicating DMP3 or IEEE 2030.5. Both of those have the ability to be encrypted. What we have seen, at least for the small, what I would call distributed systems, is that it's going to be IEEE 2030.5, or a lot of people are looking at that as their backhaul protocol. And that's a modern, well-designed, cipher suite. It's TLS 1.2, but it's also in the TLS 1.3 profile. So it's a good for where we stand now, a good cipher suite for those communications, and it's very secure. For DMP3, that is going to be your utility backhaul, and that if you use the DMP3 SAV5 or 6 or whatever they're on now, can be secured appropriately as well. Although most people just run DMP3 in the clear, and that is, that's in theory going to be your OT network for the utility, and that's probably run over cellular or radio or something like that, or a dedicated fiber line, so it's relatively secure. So lots to discuss on the protocol side, but hopefully that's a start.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay, for your time. And that's all the questions we got right now. And I appreciate so much for your time as part of the webinar series. And we will send you a nice flag, and also the recording will be available on YouTube channel. So we'll send you the link as well. Thank you, Jay Johnson, for your time.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.